I had my father's signing authority revoked. That's the clean version of what happened. The version I used with the bank, with our attorney, even with myself for longer than I'd like to admit. The messier version is that I sat across from him in his own kitchen, on a Tuesday afternoon in February, snow still on the ground outside the window over the sink, with a folder from our elder law attorney already signed and notarized, and told him that, after the incident with the wire transfer, I thought it was safest if the company and the household accounts moved to my authority alone, that this wasn't a judgment on him, only a precaution. He didn't ask to see the folder twice. He set down his coffee, looked at it for a moment the way he used to look at a scale ticket before initialing it, and said, "That's fine, Patrick. Might be smart." Then he asked if I wanted a piece of the pie Denise's mother had brought over the day before, and we ate pie at that table like nothing consequential had just happened between us. I remember driving home that afternoon thinking I'd handled something difficult with more grace than I'd expected to need. I didn't understand, not then, that he'd already moved everything that actually mattered 4 months before I ever sat down at that table. My name is Patrick Halloran. I'm 45. I run Halloran Grain and Supply, an agricultural distribution company out of a 110-acre facility just west of town that my father built from a single leased grain bin in 1981. I have a wife, Denise, 2 kids in college, and a younger sister, Colleen, who lives 2 hours away and has never worked in the business but stays close enough to my parents that I've come to rely on her, more than I probably admit, as a second set of eyes on how they're really doing. A role I don't think either of us ever formally agreed to, but that fell into place naturally once I was the one running the day-to-day, and she was the one with the clearer view from a comfortable distance. I want to walk through exactly how this happened, in the order it happened, because I've come to believe a story like this only means what it's supposed to mean if you don't skip ahead to the part that stings, the way it's tempting to when you already know how foolish the earlier part is going to make you look. This isn't a confession dressed up as an apology. It's an account, told in order, and I intend to be precise about every part of it, including the parts where I was wrong before I had any idea I was wrong. My father, David Halloran, started the business with $9,000 borrowed against his own truck and a handshake lease on a single grain bin from a farmer named Otto Reinke, who'd gone into it with him more out of curiosity than confidence, back when the two of them were still young enough that neither had much of a reputation to risk. By the time I was old enough to understand what the business was, my father had grown it into the largest independent grain and feed supplier in 3 counties, trusted by farmers who'd been burned before by outfits that quoted one price at planting and another at harvest. My father never did that. He had one habit that everyone who dealt with him eventually came to rely on. He quoted a price once, in writing if asked, and he held it, even in years when the market moved hard against him before the season closed out. I remember him telling a young farmer once, a man who'd locked in a price with us that turned out, by August, to be nearly $1 a bushel above what my father could have gotten elsewhere for the feed corn, that a contract wasn't a target to renegotiate once you didn't like how it landed. A man's word is the only inventory that never depreciates, he used to say, usually standing in the scale house doorway with a clipboard in his hand, watching a truck weigh in. I heard him say some version of that sentence more times than I can count, at the dinner table, in the truck on deliveries, standing at the counter of the co-op cafe where half his business got done over coffee that nobody billed for. I stopped really hearing it somewhere in my 20s, the way you stop hearing a clock in a room you've lived in long enough. It would turn out to matter more than almost anything else in this story. My father never had a formal office with his name on the door in gold letters. He worked out of a converted trailer at the edge of the yard for the first 15 years, moved into a modest brick building only once the business could genuinely afford it, and even then kept his own desk in the back corner rather than the office with the window, which he gave instead to whichever employee he thought needed the daylight more than he did, a decision he never once explained or seemed to think warranted explaining. He wasn't interested in the trappings of what he'd built. He was interested in whether a farmer's check would clear, whether a truck scale was calibrated to the pound, whether a contract said exactly what both parties believed it said, down to the decimal on a bushel weight. He kept a battered green ledger book in his desk drawer for years after we'd installed computerized accounting, Not because he distrusted the software, he told me once, but because writing a number down by hand made him actually look at it, rather than let it pass through him the way numbers pass through a screen, a habit I used to find almost quaint and now think about differently. When I came into the business full-time in my late 20s, after 6 years running logistics for a regional distributor 2 states over, a job that had taught me everything about margins and turnover schedules and almost nothing about the kind of trust my father had spent decades building one handshake at a time, I believed, and I still believe, there was real substance underneath the belief. That my father's instincts, sound as they'd always been, had started to lag behind a business that had grown considerably more complicated than the one he'd built. We were carrying larger lines of credit than we ever had, extended across a wider window of the growing season than his old handshake terms with the bank had ever needed to cover. We'd added a fertilizer blending operation that required environmental permitting he found tedious and occasionally forgot to renew on schedule, a lapse that had cost us a $4,000 fine one year that still bothered me more than it seemed to bother him. We'd had 2 near misses with cybersecurity, one phishing email that almost cost us a payroll run, caught only because our bank's fraud department flagged an unusual routing number the morning it was set to process. That made clear to me the business needed financial controls tighter than a single 76-year-old man keeping half his authority in his head and the other half on handwritten notes in a desk drawer that anyone walking past could, in theory, read, I told myself. And I told my wife, Denise, more than once over dinner, lying awake some nights working through the logic again as if repetition would make it more solid, that this wasn't about my father's age so much as the shape of the risk the business now carried, a risk that hadn't existed when he built the place and couldn't be managed the way he'd always managed things. On instinct and a handshake and a green ledger book. That was mostly true. It was also, I'll admit, more convenient for me to believe than the alternative, which was that consolidating financial control in my own hands simply made running the company easier, and let me stop having to explain every decision to a man whose questions, even now, tended to land closer to the center of a problem than mine did. There's a story about my father I think about often now, one he told only once, at a 4th of July gathering years before any of this began, half to the table and half to himself. The kind of story that only comes out once enough time has softened it into something safe to tell out loud. In 1993, a bad hailstorm wiped out most of a young farmer's crop 2 weeks before he was due to settle an account with us for feed and seed he'd bought on credit that spring. The farmer, a man named Kurt Alsop, who'd only been farming on his own for 2 seasons, came to my father expecting to be told he'd need to sell equipment to cover the debt, the way another supplier in the county had handled a similar situation with a different farmer the year before. My father tore up the invoice in front of him instead, told him to pay it back the following year if the harvest came in, and said nothing else about it. Kurt Alsop became one of our largest and most loyal accounts for the next 30 years, referred 6 other farmers to us over that span, and never once, as far as I know, heard my father mention that story to anyone outside the family, let alone use it to remind him of the debt he owed beyond what he'd already repaid in full the following harvest. My father told it that 4th of July only because someone at the table had asked him, admiringly, how he'd built such deep loyalty across the county, and even then he told it flatly, without any relish, as though he were reporting a weight reading rather than a kindness. I didn't think much of the story at the time. I filed it, the way I filed most of his stories, under sentiment rather than strategy, evidence of a good man rather than evidence of a shrewd one, when it turned out, eventually, to be both. The incident that gave me the opening I'd been circling for over a year happened on a Thursday morning in January, when my father received a call at the house from a man claiming to be with the ears, telling him that an old tax matter required an immediate wire transfer to avoid a lien being filed against the business that same afternoon. His voice apparently urgent enough. My father told me later that it had the particular pressure of a genuine emergency rather than the flatter, more patient tone of the scams he'd occasionally heard about secondhand. My father, sharp as he'd always been about numbers and contracts, had never had much exposure to that particular kind of fraud, the kind built entirely on manufactured urgency rather than any actual paperwork. And he called our bank himself to initiate the wire before calling me, catching it only because the teller who took the request, a young woman named Marisol who'd known our family for years, thought the request sounded strange enough to hold it and call me directly before processing anything. The wire never went through. No money moved. But it shook me in a way that felt, at the time, entirely justified, the first real evidence, in my mind, that my father's judgment had a blind spot large enough to put the company at risk, and that blind spot needed a structural answer, not just a conversation. I remember sitting in my truck in the bank parking lot after Marisol called me, running through every other close call I could think of from the past few years, building a case in my head before I'd even decided there needed to be one, the way a man convinces himself of a verdict before the trial has actually started. I met with our attorney, a careful, unhurried man named Gerald Voss, who'd handled Halloran family matters for over 20 years. Within the week, driving to his office the same afternoon I'd finished replaying the wire call in my head for the fourth or fifth time. I told him I wanted my father's signing authority on both the company accounts and the household accounts revoked, replaced entirely by my own authority under an updated power of attorney, framed as a protective measure rather than a removal of dignity, a distinction I remember insisting on more than once during that meeting, as though saying it enough times would make it more true. Gerald asked me, more than once, whether I'd discussed this with my father directly before bringing it to him for drafting. I told him I intended to, that this wasn't something I was doing behind my father's back, only ahead of a conversation I knew he'd ultimately agree with. Gerald raised an eyebrow at that phrasing but didn't push further, and drew up the documents inside of 10 days, calling me once more before finalizing them to ask, almost offhand, whether I wanted any provision for my father to regain authority later if circumstances changed, a question I answered too quickly, without giving it the consideration it probably deserved. I told him that wouldn't be necessary, and I remember him pausing on the line for a beat before simply saying he'd have the final versions ready by Friday. I drove out to the house on a Tuesday afternoon in February, the folder on the passenger seat beside me, already reviewed, already signed by Gerald's office, needing only my father's signature and a notary Gerald had agreed to send out separately later that week. My father was at the kitchen table when I came in, a cup of coffee in front of him, the newspaper folded to the grain futures page the way it always was. I sat down across from him and told him about the wire attempt, which he already knew about. And then I told him what I thought needed to happen next, that the company and household accounts would move fully under my authority, that his name would come off as a signer, that this wasn't a judgment on his capability, only a precaution against exactly the kind of exposure the Ayers call had revealed. I remember watching his face while I said it, looking for some resistance I was already prepared to counter with the wire transfer story, with the environmental permit he'd let lapse the year before, with whatever evidence I needed to make the case airtight. There wasn't any resistance. He listened to the whole thing without interrupting, the way he used to listen to a farmer explain why a load had come in underweight before he ever assigned blame, his coffee cooling in front of him, and when I finished, he didn't ask to see the folder twice. "That's fine, Patrick," he said. "Might be smart." He signed where I'd flagged, in the 2 places that didn't require the notary yet, his handwriting as steady as it had ever been on a grain contract. Then he asked if I wanted a piece of the pie Denise's mother had dropped off the day before, and we ate pie at that kitchen table like nothing consequential had happened at all, talking about whether the Hendersons' east field would need reseeding after the wet spring. I drove home that afternoon feeling the particular satisfaction of a difficult conversation handled with more grace than I'd expected to need. I did not consider, not for a moment, that a man who accepted something that easily might have already made his peace with it for reasons that had nothing to do with me. My wife Denise was less at ease with it than I was. She'd been in the kitchen doorway for part of the conversation, ostensibly getting a glass of water, close enough to catch the tone of it even if she'd missed some of the specifics, and she asked me in the truck on the way home whether I'd really given my father a chance to push back, or whether I'd simply presented him with a folder that was already signed by our attorney and let the paperwork do the talking I hadn't wanted to do myself. I told her the paperwork wasn't the point, that Dad had every opportunity to object and hadn't, and that I trusted him to tell me directly if something didn't sit right with him. He'd never been a man who hid his opinions. Not about a contract, not about a bad load of feed, not about anything that mattered to him. Denise didn't argue the point further, but she said something as we turned onto our own road that I filed away and didn't think about again for the better part of 2 years. Your dad's not the kind of man who argues with a decision he's already decided isn't worth arguing with. That doesn't mean he agrees with it. I told her she was overthinking a business decision. I believed that completely at the time, and I remember feeling, faintly, a little annoyed that she'd complicated a conversation I'd wanted to consider closed. The 18 months that followed were, by nearly every measure I was tracking, some of the steadiest the company had seen. We tightened our financial controls exactly the way I'd intended, moved payroll and vendor payments onto a system with proper dual authorization, closed out the environmental permit gap my father had let lapse, and I brought on a controller, a meticulous woman named Priya Deshmukh, who'd come to us from a larger co-op 2 counties over and reorganized our books in a way that made every board, conversation cleaner than it had ever been, replacing half my father's old handwritten notations with dashboards our local advisory board seemed genuinely impressed by. Our line of credit renewal that year went through without a single follow-up question from the bank, the smoothest one we'd had in a decade, and I remember filing the paperwork away in a drawer that used to hold my father's green ledger, that this was the proof I'd been waiting for that the whole arrangement had been the right call, vindication delivered in the form of an unremarkable, frictionless renewal letter. My father came into the yard most days, spent his mornings in the scale house the way he always had, walked the grain bins with our elevator manager, Sal, and showed up for Sunday dinner every week without fail, asking about the kids, asking in a general way how the fertilizer blending operation was doing, never once asking about the accounts he no longer had signing authority over. I took his silence on the matter, as I'd taken it that afternoon in his kitchen, as confirmation that the whole thing had settled into something he no longer thought about, that whatever pride might have been bruised had smoothed over the way most things did with him, quietly and without residue. There were 3 things, small things, that I noted during that stretch and didn't think much of until they mattered. The first was in the spring after the signing authority changed, when my father mentioned, almost in passing over Sunday dinner while passing a bowl of mashed potatoes, that he'd had lunch that week with Walt Ferris, a financial advisor out of the county seat who'd apparently managed a modest personal investment account for my parents for close to 15 years. A relationship I knew existed only in the vaguest sense, the way you know a distant cousin exists without ever thinking about what he does for a living. My father said it the way you'd mention running into an old friend at the feed store. I asked how Walt was doing. Same as always, my father said. Keeps a close eye on things. I didn't ask what things meant. I assumed it meant the ordinary, unremarkable business of a retired adjacent man checking on a modest nest egg, and I moved on to asking Denise's mother about her garden, more interested in whether her tomatoes had beaten the early blight than in an old man's investment lunch. The second was that summer, when Priya mentioned, almost as an aside while reconciling some older account records ahead of a routine audit tied to our expanded credit line, a reference to something called the Halloran Family Education Trust that she couldn't immediately match to anything in our current banking relationships. I asked her what it was. She said she assumed it was an old personal account of my parents that predated her time with the company, unrelated to the business, and that she'd only flagged it because an old wire confirmation had briefly cross-referenced our company's tax ID before being corrected. I told her not to worry about it, that it was probably some old family matter that had nothing to do with the business. And we moved on to the audit itself, which had 4 other items on it that felt considerably more urgent that week. A vendor discrepancy, a payroll tax question, 2 things that seemed, at the time, like they actually mattered. The third was smaller still, my father mentioned, one evening that fall while we were walking the yard together after dinner. The 2 of us checking the level in the number 4 bin by flashlight, that he'd spent part of a recent Saturday getting some old paperwork of your mother's and mine squared away, a phrase he used the way he used most phrases about anything he considered settled and no longer worth discussing at length. I asked if he needed help with any of it. He said no, he and Walt had already handled most of it the previous autumn, and that it was mostly things that wouldn't mean much to anyone but the two of them anyway. Then he asked whether I thought the elevator's number 3 leg needed rebelting before harvest, which was his way of ending a conversation he considered finished. None of these 3 things alarmed me. Each one was the kind of unremarkable detail that fills an ordinary year for a man in his late 70s settling into a quieter rhythm. An old friend, an old reference in a ledger, an old box of paperwork. It was only much later that I understood they weren't separate at all, and that each of them pointed at the same thing, my father, quietly and on his own initiative, attending to the one part of this family's finances that had nothing to do with the authority I'd taken from him, because it had never been reachable by that authority in the first place. I called Colleen that night, my sister, the one person in the family who'd stayed close enough to my parents to have a clearer read on them than I did despite living 2 hours away and never having drawn a paycheck from the business, and told her everything Walt had said, the words coming out faster than I meant them to. She was quiet on the line for a while, long enough that I asked if she was still there, and then she said something that stayed with me longer than almost anything else from that week, that she'd noticed, over the past couple of years, a kind of settledness in our father that she'd assumed was simply age softening him, and that she'd never once connected it to anything deliberate on his part. I thought he'd just stopped fighting for things, she said. I didn't think he'd stop needing to. I asked her whether she thought he'd ever intended for any of us to find out, or whether he'd have let the whole arrangement sit quietly forever if the loan hadn't forced Priya to go looking. Colleen didn't have an answer for that either, and neither when I asked him directly weeks later. Did our father, who only said that he supposed I'd have found out eventually, one way or another, since these things tend to surface exactly when they need to, and not a day before, a sentiment that struck me as either genuine philosophy or a very tidy way of avoiding the question, and I've never fully decided which. The turn came on a Wednesday in October, roughly 20 months after the afternoon in his kitchen, when Priya came into my office with a printout and a look on her face I hadn't seen from her before. Something between confusion and caution. We were finalizing the collateral package for a $2.4 million expansion loan to fund a new drying facility, a loan our bank had told us would be considerably easier to secure if we could show additional personal liquidity behind the company beyond our existing assets, specifically the investment account my parents had held with Walt Ferris for years, which our loan officer had understood from an old credit application years earlier, to still total somewhere north of $2 million in mostly conservative holdings. Priya had called Walt's office that morning to request updated statements for the loan package, expecting, she told me later, nothing more complicated than a routine document request of the kind she made a dozen times a month. He'd told her, politely, but without hesitation, that the account she was asking about no longer existed in the form she was describing, and that she'd need to speak with the trustee of the Halloran Family Education Trust directly, since the entirety of those assets had been retitled the previous October, a full 4 months before I'd ever sat down at my father's kitchen table with Gerald's folder, into an irrevocable trust for my children's and my sister's children's education, administered independently by Meridian Trust Company, entirely outside my father's control, and, by design, entirely outside mine. I called Walt myself that afternoon, standing at my office window watching a truck pull onto the scale outside. The same window my father used to stand at for 30 years before I'd taken the office with the daylight for myself. He was courteous, unhurried, a man clearly used to handling family finances with more discretion than drama, the kind of voice that made you understand immediately why my father had trusted him with something this significant for this long. And he confirmed what Priya had relayed almost word for word. My father had come to him the previous September, alone, driven himself the 40 minutes to Walt's office without telling anyone, and asked him to help restructure the family's investment holdings into an irrevocable trust, citing, in Walt's recollection, a wish to make sure the money was protected for the grandchildren no matter what happens with the business, or with anyone's judgment down the road, mine included. Walt said my father had been entirely clear-eyed about it, had reviewed every page of the trust documents himself over 2 separate meetings, had asked sharp, specific questions about the trustees' fee structure and the distribution schedule that Walt said he still remembered because they were better questions than most of his younger clients asked him. I asked Walt the obvious question. Had my father mentioned anything about signing authority, or about me, or about any concern connected to the company? Walt said no, not directly. Only that my father had said, almost offhand, near the end of their second meeting, that he wanted to get it done before the end of the year while I've still got all my faculties about me and nobody has cause to second-guess the decision. I sat with the phone against my ear for a long moment before I said anything else, watching the truck outside finish weighing in. The number on the scale display, clicking over the way it had 10,000 times before, without ever once meaning anything like what this number meant to me right now. That was the fact that reframed everything. The signing authority I'd revoked that February, the folder I'd driven out with, the careful protective language I'd used at his kitchen table, none of it had ever touched the one asset that actually mattered, because my father had moved it beyond anyone's reach 4 months before I'd even drafted the paperwork, quietly enough that not even Gerald, who'd handled our family's affairs for 2 decades, had any idea it had happened. He hadn't waited to see what I'd do and then reacted defensively. He'd anticipated, with a clarity I hadn't credited him with, that a moment like the one at his kitchen table might come, from me or from anyone, and he'd protected the family's real wealth before that moment ever arrived. Quietly. Without a hint of confrontation, in a conversation with a financial advisor I hadn't thought to ask a single real question about in 15 years, arranged and completed entirely on his own initiative while I was still building the case in my head for why I needed to take something from him. I drove out to see him that Saturday, the same drive I'd made 1,000 times since childhood. Past the Reinke place, past the co-op cafe where half my father's business had been built over coffee nobody billed for, the radio in my truck off the whole way because I couldn't settle on anything that felt right to listen to. He was in the scale house, going over the calibration log with our elevator manager, Sal, and he didn't stop what he was doing when I came in. Though he set the clipboard down once I started talking, the way he always had, giving whoever was speaking his full attention rather than half of it. I told him the first thing plainly, because I believed it deserved to be said plainly, that I had misjudged him, not because I thought he'd become incapable, but because I had mistaken his ease that afternoon in his kitchen for a genuine, complete acceptance of losing financial control, when in fact he'd already made sure there was almost nothing left for that control to actually touch. I told him I'd spent nearly 2 years believing I was the one protecting this family's finances, when he'd been the one who'd actually done it, a full season before I ever raised the subject. Driving himself to Walt's office alone without telling a soul, reviewing trust documents line by line at an age I'd quietly assumed made that kind of diligence unlikely. He listened to all of it without interrupting, the way he always had, and when I finished, he picked the clipboard back up, turned it over once in his hands, studying the calibration numbers the way he studied everything, and said, "You took my name off some accounts, Patrick. You never touched what I built this family on." It wasn't delivered with any edge to it. It was delivered the way he used to deliver a weight, reading off the scale. Plain, complete, not interested in whether I found it comfortable to hear. Sal had been standing near the bin ladder during part of that conversation in the scale house. Close enough that I know he heard some of it, and he found me in the yard afterward, before I got in my truck to leave, wiping his hands on a rag the same unhurried way my father always had, as though the habit had simply passed down the chain of everyone who'd ever worked closely with him. He didn't say much. Sal was never a man who said much. A trait I suspect my father had selected for without ever calling it a hiring criterion. But he told me that he'd worked under my father for 18 years and had never once seen him worried about money in a way that showed, not during the drought year, not during the year the co-op down the road undercut us on price and took 2 of our accounts, not ever, and that he'd always assumed that was just my father's temperament rather than a man who actually had things handled. Maybe it was both, Sal said, which struck me, standing there in the gravel with my truck door open, as about the most precise summary of my father anyone had ever given me. I asked him, and I heard something in my own voice I didn't especially like the sound of. Why he hadn't said any of it to me directly. Why he'd let me sit at that kitchen table with a folder and a rehearsed explanation, fully prepared to argue a case he had no intention of fighting, when he could have told me, plainly, that he'd already handled the thing I thought I was protecting. He was quiet for a moment, looking out toward the grain bins rather than at me. The late afternoon light catching the dust hanging in the scale house air, and then he said, "You'd already made up your mind before you drove out here, Patrick. I wasn't going to spend what was left of my say-so arguing about the part that didn't matter, when I could spend it quietly protecting the part that did." I asked him whether he'd ever considered using what he knew to make me answer for the assumption I'd made about him, to correct me in front of Gerald, in front of Denise, in front of anyone who might have wondered whether I'd overstepped. He looked at me for a long moment, the same unhurried look he'd given me across that kitchen table 20 months earlier, and said, "I wasn't keeping score, son. I was making sure you'd have something worth inheriting once you finally figured out what you'd missed." That was the whole of it. He didn't explain further, and I didn't ask him to. Some sentences carry more weight for what they refuse to spend on themselves, and I understood, standing there in that scale house with the dust catching the light, that this was as close as my father was ever going to come to telling me he'd been thinking about my future the entire time I'd been busy assuming his had already narrowed down to nothing worth protecting. The weeks that followed, I did the concrete work rather than the emotional kind, because I understood by then that with my father, actions had always outweighed sentiment, and that this was a trait I'd inherited from him without ever crediting where it came from. I had Gerald draft a formal restoration of my father's signing authority on both the company and household accounts, not as a courtesy, but as a genuine correction, and I asked my father, directly this time, sitting at his kitchen table again, with no folder prepared in advance, what level of authority he actually wanted going forward, rather than presenting him with a decision already made. He asked for joint signing authority alongside mine on the company accounts, with dual sign-off required above a certain threshold, a structure he said made good sense regardless of anyone's age, since 2 sets of eyes on a large transaction was simply better practice than one. No matter whose name was on the letterhead, a point he made without any hint of vindication, as though he were simply describing sound accounting rather than a correction to how I'd treated him. I agreed to it because it was, on its own merits, a better structure than the one I'd built unilaterally, and because for the first time in nearly 2 years I asked him a genuine question about how he wanted things run instead of informing him how they would be. I brought him back into the loan conversations directly, introduced him to our new bank relationship manager, not as my retired father, but as the founder and co-signer, and watched him field a question about our seasonal cash flow cycle with an ease and precision that made our loan officer, a younger man who'd only ever dealt with me, visibly recalibrate his sense of who actually understood this business best, glancing between the two of us with an expression I recognized, having worn it myself not long before, of someone realizing he'd underestimated who was actually in the room. I made a point at the next meeting with our board of local advisors of correcting the record plainly that the family's investment protection over the past 2 years had been entirely my father's doing, not mine, and that the company's expanded credit line existed in part because of judgment I'd nearly failed to give him credit for. I didn't dress it up as a grand admission. I said it the way I'd report any other fact material to the business, because by then I understood that was the only register my father would have found sincere. My father didn't make a show of any of it. He shook Walt's hand at the next visit the way he'd shaken hands after 1,000 smaller agreements over 40 years, unhurried, businesslike, no trace of vindication in it. He went back to walking the yard with Sal, checking a bearing on the number 3 leg that had been making a sound he didn't like. The same ordinary concerns that had occupied him the week before any of this surfaced and would occupy him the week after. His acceptance of the correction was exactly as measured as everything else about him, no more and no less than the moment required, and I understood, by then, that this measured quality was the only kind of approval he'd ever really given, and that I'd simply spent most of my adult life failing to recognize it as one, expecting some grander gesture that was never going to arrive because it had never been how he moved through the world. I don't know how to close a story like this with anything grander than what actually happened, which is that I spent nearly 2 years believing my father's ease that February afternoon was surrender, when it was already the far side of a decision he'd made without me, quietly, on his own schedule, in a way that never once asked for my permission or my notice. There's a particular kind of pride that assumes a quiet man has run out of moves simply because he stopped making them where you can see, and I carried that pride long enough that it nearly cost me the chance to understand, while he was still here to explain it himself, exactly how much he'd already done to protect what none of my paperwork had ever actually reached. I think now about that green ledger book he kept for years after we'd gone digital, the one where he wrote every number down by hand because it made him actually look at it, and I wonder whether that habit of his, looking closely at the thing everyone else assumed was settled, was the same instinct that sent him to Walt Ferris's office alone on a September morning, a full season ahead of a conversation he must have known, on some level, was coming for him eventually. My father never raised his voice through any part of it. He never needed to. He'd finished protecting what mattered a full season before I ever thought there was anything left worth protecting from him, and he did it in the same quiet, unhurried way he'd done everything else in his life, without asking anyone's permission, and without ever once making sure I knew to be grateful for it. I've thought, since then, about what I would have done in his position, whether I'd have had the patience to let a son believe he'd won something for 2 full years, without once needing him to know the truth of it before he was ready to hear it, without once trading that patience for the smaller satisfaction of being proven right sooner. I'm not sure I would have managed it. I think that's part of what I owe him now, alongside the trust restructuring and the joint signing authority and the correction I made at that board meeting, an honest accounting of the fact that his restraint took a kind of discipline I'm still working to understand, let alone match, and may never fully match, given how many years he had to practice it before I ever gave him a reason to need it. If this one sat with you the way it sat with me, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more measured, honest stories.